As the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game surpasses 16 years of production outside of Japan, with no sign of stopping anytime soon, the pool of cards available to play is large, to say the least. From the armory of powerful spell cards Magic Ruler, to the fast-paced Dark Attribute support in Phantom Darkness, and even the format-changing Duelist Alliance, each of the past 68 mainstream booster pack sets has offered something new to the table in its own right. Although Magic Ruler was the first set to release a dedicated archetype in the form of tunes, archetypes have since become a standard for booster pack sets, and in many cases, the set's quality as a whole is often judged by the power of its archetypes. Each booster pack set has no more than 100 spots, so not all archetypes can indefinitely receive support, often being cycled out for newer archetypes. With that being said, the game has seen a resurgence of legacy support in the last few years, in some cases nearly a decade after their previous release. And while not all support cards are created equal, on more than one occasion, a card has been released that single-handedly transformed its deck into a force to be reckoned with. While many would assume that legacy support only became common as the game aged, in actuality, it's played a vital role in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! For well over a decade now. One of the earliest cases of strong legacy support came in Ronin Totem, a key piece in the Frog deck that allowed it to evolve into a first-turn kill deck after a year or two of scattered support. Gravekeeper's Recruiter in particular stands out as a singular card that immediately made a once obscure archetype erupt into the metagame. Releasing in Starstrike Blast as a TCG exclusive, Recruiter was a follow-up to the Gravekeeper support from Absolute Power Force, which contained the first support for its archetype in nearly 3 years. Acting as one half of the now classic Descendant plus Recruiter combo, along with 3 copies of the devastating Royal Tribute, the release of Gravekeeper's Recruiter elevated the Gravekeeper deck to the top tables as the strongest anti-meta deck in the game. However, Recruiter was a TCG exclusive, and as such, the OCG's format at the time did not reflect the same success, but more on that later. Instead, a certain support card released in both territories around the same time deserves the spotlight. While the Primal Origin set has since faded into obscurity, it was reasonably impactful on its release, and offered more to the game than it would appear to at first glance. As the final booster set of the Zexal era, Primal Origin focused primarily on Bujin and Sylvan support, as well as many cards from the anime belonging to the Galaxy and Number archetypes. It also introduced artifacts to the game, a popular engine still seeing fringe competitive play 4 years later. What was truly interesting about Primal Origin, however, is that along with its primary attractions, the set included legacy support for 10 different decks that hadn't received new cards in over a year. Ancient Gears, Dark Worlds, Gladiator Beasts, even Scraps among others received a new card designed to help bolster their decks and give it a much needed upgrade. Although not every deck given support ended up at the forefront of the metagame, these new support cards would become staples in their respective decks. Out of all of them, however, there was one exception, and that was Madolche, receiving a brand new card known as Madolche Angeli that would take the archetype to new heights. Before the release of Angeli in May 2014, the Madolche deck was relatively obscure. It had acquired 10 regional tops and 3 premier tops since its release in August 2012. Although fairly represented, as well as making an appearance in the top 32 of the 2013 North American World Championship qualifier against a field of Dragon Rulers and Spellbooks, the deck was a far cry from Tier 1 status. Most successful Madolche decks either built their decks to combat the format or took more of an anti-meta approach. Madolche Angeli made an impact because of its ability to introduce speed and utilize its power plays in Madolche Queen Tiara Masu more consistently. Tiara Masu proved especially deadly as it found itself in a format of floaters that traditional removals such as number 101, Cell on R cannot handle, and is still acclaimed to this day. Angeli sported a simple effect, allowing a player to tribute a Madolche monster, even itself, to special summon another Madolche monster from the deck, while also protecting it from destruction by battle until the end of the next turn. 2-card combos ending with a Levier the Sea Dragon, a rank 4, and the choice of Madolche Chateau or Madolche Ticket suddenly became possible thanks to Angeli's power. YCS Philadelphia was held shortly after the release of Primal Origin, and although the top 32 playoff was played using Battle Pack drafts and not constructed decks, Christopher LeBlanc was able to win the event, piloting a Madolche deck up until the playoff. Madolche would then go on to compete against the other top dogs of the format, some of which formerly oppressed the deck pre-Angeli. And although it was never considered the best deck, it managed to accumulate multiple premier tops and 2 wins across multiple countries' national championships. Once considered to be a rogue strategy, Madolche proved itself to be a formidable meta contender with the release of Angeli, even snagging a top 8 seat at the 2014 North American World Championship qualifier. Madolche Angeli was released into the TCG at the perfect time, as the format had just shifted into one of the most diverse it's ever had thanks to Primal Origin and Dragons of Legend. Additionally, it came a few months before Shaddoll entered the TCG, a deck able to inherently ignore the combos Angeli offered thanks to cards like El Shaddoll Winda, which prevented special summoning more than once a turn. Against the odds, Madolche was still able to acquire a few regional tops as well as a premier top 8 post-Duelist Alliance, but overall, the deck was pushed aside in favor for new powerhouses such as Burning Abyss and the aforementioned Shaddoll decks. Coupled with the release of the Cleefort deck a few months later in the new Challengers, Medolce was obsolete, disappearing from the competitive scene until a year later with the release of Brilliant Fusion. Released a mere 3 months before one of the most influential sets of the game's history, it would have been easy to release Medolce and Jelly in Duelist Alliance, a set that also included legacy support but maintained a much sharper power creep. Had that been the case, there's a strong argument that Medolce wouldn't have performed nearly as well as it did. This can actually be asserted by taking a look at another influential card released around the same timeframe as Angeli, but one that didn't see a similarly optimal time release. The card in question? Chronomaly Neverdisk. Before talking about Chronomaly Neverdisk at length, it's important to understand the state of the game at this point in time. With the OCG and TCG adopting different Forbidden and Limited lists as of September 2013, the two territories were split farther than they've ever been. For the last few years, the TCG received an additional 10 cards in their mainstream booster sets that were created specifically for that territory, known as Exclusives. Some of the most relevant cards in this game's history started off as TCG Exclusives, such as Allure of Darkness, Charge of the Light Brigade, the aforementioned Gravekeeper's Recruiter, Tour Guide from the Underworld, Wind Up Shark, among many, many others. By releasing exclusive cards tied to newer or promoted decks at the time, the TCG's metagame became much more different than the OCG's, further differentiating the game between territories even with the same Forbidden and Limited list. As the TCG Forbidden and Limited list was a copy of the OCG's, the list would primarily reflect hits meant to address their metagame and not necessarily ours. This led to a series of complaints and frustrations over innocent cards being hit over cards that were genuinely problematic, but that's a different topic for a different day. The important takeaway is that the territories were drifting apart, and now, with the OCG set to release their first booster set since the Forbidden and Limited list split, they had the freedom to do whatever they wanted without worrying about the implications on the TCG. Starting with Legacy of the Valiant, the OCG began creating OCG exclusives, much like how the TCG had been doing. OCG exclusives were deemed controversial by the majority of TCG players, as the territory already had first access to most new cards on release, as well as several more releases and promo opportunities the TCG didn't have. A backlog of cards yet to be imported for the TCG was already growing, and now, each mainstream booster set received 10 cards that would remain exclusive to OCG territories for an extended period of time. Chronomaly Neverdisk was among these cards, and had a powerful effect that transformed a deck otherwise destined for mediocrity to a Tier 1 contender. The ability to search cards belonging to an archetype is one commonplace in several competitive decks, as it allows the user to cycle through their deck and add cards needed to continue their strategy. Neverdisk holds that ability while being a cut above others, as it isn't restricted to strictly Chronomaly monsters and can instead search any card in the archetype. Within the context of its deck, Neverdisk's search effect came as a boon and significantly boosted consistency, which was previously limited to Chronomaly Crystal Skull, which could only search Chronomaly monsters. Additionally, Crystal Skull was a 1-for-1, as it required itself to be discarded to search, whereas Neverdisk would generate a +1 in card advantage when it was summoned. What truly made Neverdisk special, however, was its second effect to revive itself from the graveyard, at the cost of being restricted to Chronomaly effects for the rest of the turn. As the game was significantly slower than it is now, decks that required setup had much more leeway for success. With a card such as Neverdisk, a player would be able to assemble card combinations with its ability to search, then later return in the game to be utilized with what it searched. Neverdisk both supported previously inconsistent combos while enabling new ones, and with the release of artifacts in the next set, Primal Origin, another level 5 based archetype, Chronomaly artifacts became one of the hottest decks of the OCG, capable of stunning the opponent on their turns and wiping out their life points the next. Until the release of Duelist Alliance, Chronomaly artifacts were a top contender in the metagame, proving so powerful that Neverdisk was actually semi-limited on the OCG's July 2014 Forbidden and Limited list. But why wasn't this true in the TCG? Recall that Chronomaly Neverdisk was an OCG exclusive. As mentioned previously, OCG exclusives weren't available in the TCG for quite a while after their initial release. This meant that the TCG experienced formats under Legacy of the Valiant and Primal Origin where Chronomaly artifacts either didn't exist or weren't successful. Eventually, however, the TCG received a booster set comprised of former OCG exclusives known as World Superstars. Neverdisk had finally made it to both territories, but things weren't quite the same as its initial release in the OCG. In April 2015, when World Superstars released, the deck's Chronomaly artifacts competed against were no more, instead replaced by Nekroz, Burning Abyss, a TCG exclusive archetype, Shaddolls, Cleefort, and the occasional Satellar Knight deck. All of these decks were leaps and bounds stronger than the now dated Chronomaly artifacts, essentially a year old by the initial TCG release. To make matters worse, although not tied to Chronomaly, the artifact engine saw great success in the TCG, most prominently featured in the extremely popular Hat deck, the eventual winner of the 2014 North American World Championship qualifier. Due to its popularity, Artifact Moraltag was limited to one copy on the January 1st, 2015 Forbidden and Limited list. Although Artifact Scythe would eventually replace the two missing copies of Moraltag and Artifact engines, It wasn't quite as effective at that point, especially as the most popular deck, Nekroz, didn't rely on its extra deck. Between this restriction and the increased power creep set by Duelist Alliance, Chronomaly Artifact never stood a chance in the TCG, failing to top even a regional in release and fading into obscurity. In many senses, Chronomaly Neverdisk is a perfect example of too little, too late. A confident deck that took the OCG by storm couldn't even achieve a regional top 1 year later, and players who didn't pay attention to the other territory never would have known how powerful the deck actually was. And what has to be the most ironic part of the story is that Primal Origin, the set giving Chronomaly the artifacts to put them over the edge, also featured Benolce Angele, which was able to immediately upgrade the deck in both territories. As stated earlier, Primal Origin led to one of the most diverse formats in the game's history, and Chronomaly Artifact more than likely would have been able to find a place in a metagame that progressively grew more complex the longer it went on. The point of contention here is that when designing legacy support, it has to be created with the average power level in the current format, and then release it within that format. If the format is fast and games rarely exceed 4 turns, the support must be able to keep up with the speed of those competing decks, or it's bound to flop. On average, cards designed for fast formats tend to fare better than those created during slower formats, as they're more often than not able to survive in similarly quick tempo formats, and actually thrive when the tempo is slower. Legacy support has and will continue to remain the backbone of core set releases, and with hundreds of archetypes existing within the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game, it's only a matter of time until a player's favorite strategy gets their own comeback tour of sorts. As the TCG continues to lag behind the OCG when it comes to card distribution, it's fair to assume that even in 10 years, TCG players will still continue to anticipate the latest imports from Japan. Though it's inevitable that some cards won't be imported until it's much too late, for as many cards that don't see the light of day in time, there's another one that does and completely changes the format. When properly utilized, the concepts of legacy support and localization, while appearing completely different at first glance, play off each other like a strand of DNA, and can culminate towards a truly meaningful addition to the card game. From Frogs to even Chronomaly, it's anyone's guess as to what deck will receive support next, and have its chances the best of the format. So next time an old strategy gets support, be it in a mainstream booster set, a structure deck, or even a duelist pack, don't write it off. It might just be tomorrow's next big deck.